I'm with Dr. Bill Byrne, who's now retired, and happily retired. But there was a time when Bill was my boss, and Bill was the man who was really instrumental in getting the Head Smashed In Interpretive Center building constructed. And that dates way back to the 1980s, actually into the 70s in terms of the initial workings of that. And Bill was a unique individual to have in government because, for one thing, he has a background in archaeology, and he had dug at this site way back in the 1960s. Bill, I guess that was your introduction to Head Smashed In, was coming here with Barney Reeves.
Very much so, yeah. I'd been by it before, but the first year that Dr. Brian Reeves, Barney, excavated out here, I was part of that original crew that excavated in the jump area. That first year, we concentrated on the jump portion primarily. As
I recall from what things you've told me at other times, you knew even then that this would be just a great site to put something at. That of all the sites in Alberta that you might choose to interpret to the general public, Head Smashed In is one that just stood out.
I think all of us that worked on it in the initial years recognized that there was something pretty special here. We'd all seen a number of other archaeological sites in the province, campsites, jump sites, different kinds of localities, but the sheer scale and complexity of what was reflected here at Head Smashed In, it was pretty evident that this was something special, particularly given the fact that the state of preservation of the thing was clearly head and shoulders above many of the sites. I mean, it's well known that a big problem with a lot of the junk, particularly the bigger jumps, was that they were bone mined during the First World War for minerals. And so many of them were virtually decimated, whereas for whatever reason there was little or none of that kind of activity here at Head Smashed In. So even though it was probably the largest such site, certainly on the Canadian prairies, it was basically in the last use condition of when it had been last used by natives in early historic times.
One of the stories I heard about why this was ignored as opposed to other jumps when it came to that kind of looting the bone for use as phosphorus and for making gunpowder and fertilizer was because it is quite a remote location, and we're just a long ways from any railhead, and the bone, you know, from the sites that were mined, it tended to come from buffalo jumps that are really close to rail lines, and so then it was easily loaded and transported. Head Smashed In is quite distant for many, so that's one reason why it wasn't mined.
Yeah, I think that's probably a real contributing factor in it as well.
I would think if I was digging here like you were back in the 60s, and if you're thinking later about a site that you might develop for the public, we have a lot of great sites in Alberta that tell interesting stories, but there's something about a buffalo jump that's special, and I think a lot of it is the drama of the story. I mean, this is a site where you've got danger and blood and guts and trauma and excitement, and in a matter of moments there's this flurry of activity and people shouting and animals running, and we've got great campsites and places where, you know, important parts of the prehistoric story of Alberta went on, but they don't have the drama. This place does.
I think that's true, and I think the other thing that struck everyone right from the outset here is simply the location of it in terms of the vistas you get here. I mean, buffalo jumps, by definition, people have a tendency to think that they're big high cliffs, but of course the reality is they're not. They have to be fairly small because otherwise the amount of damage that's done to the animals when they go over the jump renders them virtually useless. But you had a kind of a unique situation here where you have a relatively low cliff, 30 odd feet, something in that neighborhood, 10 meters somewhere, but it is situated then on a very high bench so that you have this unbelievable vista. Well, that doesn't happen very often with buffalo jumps. Most of them are in much more modest kind of locations, even though they have a similar cliff height, a similar drop height. They don't have the kind of vista that you get here at Head Smashed In, and that was another thing that made it extremely appealing. That's
a good point, because I've been to quite a few jumps myself, and most of them are at the absolute low point of some of the topography of the area. In many cases, a river valley or a creek valley. It's the prairie level and then a drop down, and so you're literally in the very valley bottom. Exactly. So you have absolutely no view, in fact.
Exactly.
So here, they're landing on this bench that's created by slump deposits coming off this bedrock, and to the people using it at the time, they probably didn't care about the view all that much, but to us, it's a great feature for
Yeah.
this interpretive center.
Yeah.
And I think it's something I've heard the tourists talk about is they've come here, especially foreign tourists, because they just don't have this kind of open landscape like we do, where you can see for literally kilometers and kilometers here with almost nothing in the way.
Yeah.
And that's just not true in parts of Europe, and in fact in many parts of the United States
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
So you get this tremendous feeling. I've always kind of likened it to people coming here and feeling like they can still feel the sort of how it might have worked, because there's not houses and high-rises all around you, and there's one road, there's one parking lot, and they're off to the side, and you can look at all this and kind of say, yeah, I get the idea of how this story actually happened.
Absolutely, and again, because of the nature of the use of the land out here, where there's very little breakage of the soil, very little of intensive agriculture, it is mostly grazing. You've got the added benefit that so much of this basically looks very similar to what it would have looked like, 100 years, 500 years ago, 5,000 years ago. Sure, the exact nature of the shrubbery and the grasses and whatnot will vary, but fundamentally you're going to get this wide open landscape of these rolling small coulee systems and whatnot.
That's right, yeah.
That's hard to come by.
Yeah, ranching lays a really light hand on the landscape, and it's very similar to what bison grazing would have been like, so it hasn't really changed all that much.